good to see a lot of you again. I recognize most of you. For those who don't recognize, sorry I haven't been here for several months. I try to make it a habit of coming back a couple times a year and just talking about whatever's fun and cool at Microsoft. Although I know with your upcoming SORT conference, you're going to have a lot more of what's cool, and that's great. Today I'm going to talk about .NET Core and Bash, basically some open source stuff. I think I talked a little bit about Microsoft and open source probably the last couple times I was here. So I'm just going to say it one more time, but I'm going to talk about it with some specific technology, specifically .NET Core and Bash. I also know at the SORT conference you're going to be able to go into the .NET stuff a little deeper, I think. So this is a good primer if you've not already seen .NET Core. That's me. So we're going to talk about .NET, the evolution of .NET, and what .NET Core is. We're going to talk about it not only on the server, which is what everyone thinks of it as, ASP.NET Core, but also what that means on the client side and from a tools perspective, and roadmap. And like I said, we're also going to talk about Bash at the end. I don't put it on this agenda. You'll see it later on. So starting with this, .NET is awesome, right? I hope I'm talking to a group of .NET developers. I'm not terribly controversial in this discussion. Over 1 billion installations used in the smallest of the largest of devices, big servers, IoT devices, very, very productive environment, very good, and a big player in the developer platform wars, right? I know you have that here. You'll talk to some of your coworkers, your brethren, and they might say, "Oh no, .NET's terrible." There are much better options out there, and you know, I'm hopeful that a lot of you say, "No, .NET's better." And that's what we've seen. We've seen this for well over a decade, where these are the two big things that we see. Right? This is what enterprise development, real development, is about. Latest salvo, Oracle did some reorgs. They're the ones supporting Java, and they basically laid off a lot of people, or moved to another area. A lot of people are working on Java, so cool. I guess we won this battle. And no, that's just another salvo. Oracle comes back and says, no, we're really going to be... But the fact is, well, we're tit for tat, .NET Java. There's a completely different world out there that we were kind of ignoring. It wasn't just .NET and Java. There's a lot of other things going on out there. Both .NET and Java, but I'd say especially .NET, have been overlooked a lot in the recent years, 5, 6, 7 years. Universities, the talent of the future for developers, barely acknowledge these two as existing. They look at things like JavaScript, they're doing Node, Angular, lots of other technologies that is becoming the new standards for enterprises. So am I making you feel really good? I'm telling you your skill set's obsolete? I'm not telling you that, obviously. But I am saying that Microsoft acknowledges and recognizes that open source is a real thing. It's not just a passing idea. It's not something that you can't ignore it. It's real. And Microsoft has invested a lot. In Azure, over a third of our VMs are running in Linux. Okay, and we have to make sure that that crowd is well represented and understood. We have lots of tools for it. We have lots of things we've open sourced ourselves. Some of these things we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the .NET Core assets. The .NET Foundation, I think I've talked about it before, is our umbrella organization that manages the open sourcing of some stuff we do, but not only us, but also others in the .NET community. So Xamarin has stuff in there, and various others are open sourced and readily available. But when you actually put the rubber to the road and look at what's going on, this is statistics from GitHub taken 2 days ago. Organizations with the most open source contributors. Not Google, not Amazon, definitely not Apple, Microsoft. Is that a surprise? It was a surprise to me. And amongst the most actively contributed repositories, one of them is a Microsoft, VS Code. We'll show that as a side effect later on. So this is not your Microsoft of yesterday. When I talk about Java and .NET being the big things that are competing out there, it's really open source that's competing to the enterprise space. And Microsoft is becoming a player in open source in a big way. So back to the platform wars. .NET had to evolve, right? The future of .NET, we still have .NET 4.6. It's not going away. It has the rich Windows integration, all the stuff you're used to. Knows IIS, knows Windows desktops, WPF. It does all these things very well. And that's not going away. But we've recognized that in the open source world, we have to be able to talk to, work with Android, iOS, Linux, Mac, everything with your tools, your technologies, and we've refactored .NET for that purpose, and that's called .NET Core. So I'm going to look around the room, see if anybody's awake. How many of you have heard of .NET Core? Okay, I think there was one person who decided they didn't want to put the effort into it, but that's what I expected. That's good. So one more slide on open source before we actually dig into .NET Core. I found this interesting. So of those open source contributors, if you look at the colors here, these are the different open source libraries that Microsoft are in the .NET Foundation. And the number one contributor there, Gabriel, is not a Microsoft employee. And I think we actually filtered out the Microsoft employees. He's a Google employee. So it's kind of interesting. Contributing to Microsoft assets, specifically .NET Core, or the .NET family of projects, outside of Microsoft is a Google employee. Oh, brave new world. Isn't that interesting? So now we can get into the topic for today, right? .NET Core. Everyone already heard what it is. To review what you probably already know, .NET is .NET, except when it's not. We start with the core foundation, all the tools, libraries at the base level, and add in the framework on top of it. So .NET 4.6 is exactly what you're used to. It integrates very tightly with Windows, completely full-featured, very mature. WPF, WinForms, probably have a couple of those out there still. ASP.NET, extremely popular, very productive environments. And on the .NET Core side, we have a slightly different take. .NET Core was originally ASP.NET 5. So if you go back and look back in time, ASP.NET 5 caused a lot of confusion. This did come from the ASP.NET team before it became a more holistic vision. And that's because now we also have the ability to run .NET Core on our devices. Universal Window apps, Universal Windows Platform is based on .NET Core. So we have ASP.NET Core that talks to the Core CLI and is cross-platform. That's primarily for server-based applications. Not that you're necessarily going to run a server on your Mac, but you could in theory. But you definitely could develop on it. So that's ASP.NET primarily, and the Universal Windows apps side of things. .NET Core can be used to compile down to native code in .NET Native. So that's probably something you didn't necessarily think about unless you're actually actively interested. But it's the same frameworks that drive both of those, and of course different libraries depending on whether you're targeting a server application or a client application. Now, one thing to realize about .NET Core is in this massive refactoring, it has become highly modular. .NET 4.6, you install it on your Windows server, your Windows desktop, and you get everything. If you're going onto a Windows server, hey, great, you get WPF. Are you going to need it? No, who cares? You get it anyway, right? In .NET Core, you get only what you need. You bring down the libraries and the packages of what you need. That modularity allows you to tailor your solutions to what you would need, but also keep them extremely lightweight. So it gives us the ability to actually effectively X-copy our entire framework, all the things we need to run our application with our application. So I don't need to have an install for the framework on my server or on my desktop. I can more or less X-copy it. So for those of you doing ASP.NET, and you're saying, well, I really have this great feature in .NET 4.6.1, and I really want to use it, but the servers are running .NET 4.0, so I can't use it because we don't want to upgrade the server because it'll break all my other ASP.NET applications. As we get into .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, that problem goes away. You can use .NET Core 1.0, and sitting right next to it on the same server can be something that's in the future .NET Core 1.1. No compatibility issues, X-copied with the application. So that's hopefully an interesting and useful thing. Now, open source, and Microsoft's not the first to use. You look at things like Red Hat. Red Hat, Linux, open source. But what do you get with Red Hat? You're getting the support structure behind it. So we have open source. You can download, you can fork the code, you can bring down the entire .NET distribution, you can compile it, you can create your own version of .NET, whatever you want to do. But you pull down one of our distributions, you get the Microsoft support you're used to. We're going to make sure it's security tested, we're going to make sure that it's hardened, we're going to make sure that it's performant, we're going to do everything we can. We have teams of developers behind this. So we accept contributions from Google or wherever else, but before it actually makes it into one of our distributions, it becomes a supportable product, just like you expect with .NET 4.6, right? And as you see, we're assuming anything we put out, high quality for Linux, Mac OS, and Windows, stable for x86, x64, and the ARM varieties, multiple releases a year, and anything we get from the community, we'll make sure actually aligns to these. So from a support perspective, we don't support everything out there. No kidding. We never have, right? I mean, you go back in time, do we support Windows XP? Not anymore. And there's a reason for that. But we do support Windows 7. And so in this case, .NET Core supports Windows 7, Service Pack 1 and greater, or Windows Server 2008 R2 and greater in both x86 and x64. Lots, but far from all Linux distributions. So there are many, many, many Linux distributions. One of the big questions that we get from the community out there is, why aren't you supporting my flavor of Linux? I really prefer it to the other ones. Well, because it takes time and money to actually verify all these things. And if we're going to support it, we need to make sure we've actually verified, tested, and we have support plans for it. They have goals to add more and more Linux distributions. So if you're interested in that, watch for the list to grow. But you can see there, the most popular ones are already supported. And of course, Mac OS X. This is something I was watching the history of the OS X port. It was something that we always had on our roadmap. But the initial seeds for this one actually came from the community. Somebody who's a real rock star in the community, there's a real Mac user, got the Linux port and did the changes and put a pull request in to say, hey, Microsoft, you should include these things so we have Mac support as well. So they beat us to the punch. The community beat us to the punch. And with a little bit of negotiation, we accepted those pull requests, and they're now part of the product. It's evolved a lot since then. Now, like I say, this is something that's really good from a server perspective. We're not going to be running WPF applications on a Mac with this. This is really for ASP.NET. So why do I put it on a Mac? Because we don't see a lot of Mac servers out there. Because it's a very popular developer platform, right? So if you're a developer, you have a MacBook, fantastic. You know, we're happy to work with you on it. Use whatever tools you want to write C#.NET code, ASP.NET Core applications. Now, where we start with all this is at the command line. If you're going to run this on a Linux box or a Windows box or a Mac, you're going to have to install the core shims. They actually give you this, and you do that through a command line. The command line gives you access to this. It's a basic set of stuff that works across all platforms that pulls down enough that it can shim in. I told you can X-copy the framework. Basically, you can, but you need the shim in there to actually get to the point where you can execute it. This is what the command line does. I'm going to say going forward, you're going to see most of what Microsoft does from a dev space acknowledges and embraces command line first. If you're like me, a Visual Studio developer, you like the ability to file new project, hit F5, and have a fairly feature-rich thing already started. I don't want to start from the ground up and start typing characters for 3 days before I have a working application. But there are some people who like that. And of course, I'm joking a little bit. There's a lot of tools out there aside from Visual Studio that are good for building up applications. But command line first means bring your own tools. Visual Studio will provide a first-class experience for these. But if you're doing, Notepad++, great. You can do your entire development in that if you want to, and you can have all the compilers and everything tie right into it. So I want to show you a couple of links real quick before I get into the first real demo. First of all, just to say, yes, it is real. Microsoft has a very large set of hubs on source repositories on GitHub. As you know, we've had our own Codeplex and other things in the past where we've tried to compete for the open source mindshare, and we finally said, you know what? We acknowledge we don't own that space. GitHub really does. It used to be SourceForge, now it's GitHub. And therefore, we're playing with the community. This is where they expect to find open source assets. We have lots of repos in here with all our stuff, including, you wonder what the .NET framework looks like. This is CoreFX. This is the .NET framework. You could go ahead and pull this down and start looking at it. You can look at it back to back. You'll see some of this is actually platform specific. System.core. So the source in this case is all C#. Okay, I picked the wrong one. Core is not a good one. But we have C#, and then we have C++ at the core runtime, the core CLI or C++ or C, and it needs to be. But of course, in the Linux world and the Mac world, we can use the same source code base and just do the platform-specific compilers. However, the framework itself is written in C#, so you can pull it down and start playing with it if you want to. The other tab I'm going to show you is this. I talked a little bit about the fact that we didn't lose the platform wars, but the world changed. What we thought of platform wars was different. I will say Microsoft is now putting a lot of effort into trying to re-embrace the younger developers, the ones that are still in school. I'm going to scroll down to the bottom of this page because, we have things like this that you've seen before. There we go. I don't think you're called the Jedi anymore, are you? But I mean, that's if you're getting started with C#, this is meant to be something to get you up to speed quickly. Nobody in the room has to worry about that, but the people in college, we're trying to get into those mind shares so that this becomes relevant. I think it's a very powerful product, and we're trying to make sure it is relevant. But the real reason we're out here is actually talk about installing on it. So if you want to go out there and do an install, this actually does give you the ability to download based on what your platform is, and it gives you instructions. So Windows, Linux. So I want to do it on Ubuntu, and it says, well, here's what you have to do. And it's using the standard stuff you would on Linux. And I've already done this for my demo machine, so I don't have to do it. But it's something we're installing .NET. The framework takes just a matter of moments. So, question?
I was just going to say, I've done this on Ubuntu. And when you're on the church network, it blocks the key server for some reason. So you got to do it off of the church network, and then you'll be fine after that. But it's
after the VM up and running, it's all okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for the insight. And unfortunately, I'm not surprised. All right, so there it is. Easy to get up and going, whether you're working on Mac or Docker or whatever else. A few lines of code, and you have .NET installed. And what does it mean after you have .NET installed? It means something like this. So let me go find my mouse. There we go. Reset this. I'm remoted into, or almost remoted into, a machine running up in Azure. This is a Ubuntu 14 series VM. And I've already installed .NET on this. Okay. So I'm going to make a directory. Oh no, I already have a directory. I'm going to make another directory because I've already done this demo. Net2. So empty folder, nothing in there, nothing on my sleeve. And here's the .NET runtime, installed and showing the same sets of commands that we were seeing a second ago, right? And this is what I use to create new projects if I want to. New projects are just sets of text files. Restore will go into, it's like I said, tightly coupled with NuGet. Publish, build, run unit tests, and package for creating your own NuGet packages that you can share with others. So if I do .NET new, this gives me, it works better if I type the right word. Gives me the shim. It scaffolds my initial program. There it is, hello world. Just like you learned to write the very first time you went to C#. But there's another file in there as well, project.json. This is the starting point. If you think about using Visual Studio, you always have the CS proj files. This is kind of the analogy. It provides the information about, the metadata about my project. What frameworks am I targeting? What references, what dependencies do I have? And that type of stuff. It all is in a nice JSON format, so it's a little easier to read than the XML we've seen before. But the same basic concept. So before I can run this, I have to do a restore. As I said, .NET is highly modular, and is this one going to bite us too?
What?
Is this one going to bite us too?
No, I had a question about the project.json.
Yeah.
Well, I was reading recently that Microsoft actually, for NuGet, they'll keep project.json, but for the build they're just going to merge it all back into MS Build. Is that the case? And when?
I don't think that's completely the case. So, and I can't tell you all the details because I don't have them. I've heard the same rumors, and I don't know if everyone heard that.
Well, I read it on a Microsoft blog.
Yes.
From Microsoft.
And the question is how much? So the ASP.NET team that started this entire project looked at project.json from an open source perspective, and that was a common way of doing this type of thing. And so they went whole hog that direction. And then the rest of the community, or the rest of the Microsoft community said, well, wait, we want to use it for mobile, we want to use it for Windows, et cetera, et cetera. That doesn't quite work. So we pulled it back, but I don't think we pulled it back all the way. So .NET Core 1.1, I think will be pretty close to the final version in terms of this balance. And there is now an X project. We'll find out when we get to the demo.
Yeah, and I heard they were doing away with X Proj and just going back to
CS project.
Because of what you said, so that they could merge all of those different.
Yes, and have them not fight with each other, basically. And you're exactly right. But that said, going back, how much is going to be in the CS proj file and how much is going to be in the project.json? And like you said, the references are definitely going to be there. How much else? I don't know. I mean, I think one of the big things we don't see here, if you're doing an ASP.NET project, it was very easy to say, everything in this folder is part of the solution. I don't need to list out all the files. If you look at a CS proj file, you list out all the files. If you go to something that's not a web application, that becomes a little less meaningful. All of a sudden, controlling which files go into it becomes a little more important. So the file list might be in there.
Yeah. Well, and that's one thing they mentioned is that they wanted to merge the nice features of project.json where like you didn't have to list every single file in your build folder or in your CS proj file and all those other things. But I was just curious if it was going to happen anytime soon, like with the next release of Visual Studio or anything like that.
Yeah, and I can't tell you because I don't know, but my inclination, my guess is yes. I think we'll see it in the what I would guess to be Visual Studio 2016, but no one's told me that officially. I would expect we'll see it then. What I do know when we get to the roadmap, .NET Core 1.1 is supposed to come out this fall. If I read the tea leaves in terms of how our marketing department tends to put things out, we're doing Ignite right now as we speak, but we're also doing a Visual Studio Connect event probably in a November timeframe. And that, again, reading the tea leaves, no one's told me this, and knowing that everyone in the room is under NDA. Don't publish to YouTube until November. I would guess that we're going to see the stars start to align. And this will probably evolve for a while, but yes, the two of them are going to merge in some way, shape, or form, but not be a single file. Good questions. I'd already done the restore earlier, because if I hadn't, it would have spent a lot of time going to NuGet and pulling down a lot of files. And it would have taken enough time, especially on a network that I wasn't sure of, because I'm using a Wi-Fi right now, or a Verizon card. I didn't want to risk it. And it did write a lock file. The lock file basically enumerates the things that are in the cache that are required for this. So this has pulled down all the dependencies for the whole world application. And actually, let's look at the lock file. Oh. So, no, I'm not going to read all that. But this is the stuff that it captured as part of that, so it knew which things it pulled down into the cache and which things are needed to run Hello World. And it's obviously a lot more than you might have thought, but that's because it's a very granular framework now. I don't install the monolith known as .NET 4.6. So now, I can run it. And you get the impressive, I should have done a build first, but obviously that's implicit. There we go. How's that for impressive? Hello world. But I did it on a Linux box from the command line. Nothing up my sleeves. Yeah, it's kind of neat. And I expect that's stuff you guys have kind of seen before. I do want to say there's a lot of investment in this from the community already. A lot of things already support it. So if I go and look at, for example, NuGet, and do the magic search. A lot of things from the community, MySQL, Unity, whatever else. But you'll also see a lot of .NET Core things that are specific to .NET Core, bringing down individual components. So Microsoft .NET Core platforms, Universal Windows Platform, .NET Core. This is effectively bringing the framework down as a NuGet package. So again, that's my X copy.
Can I interrupt you for just a second?
Please.
We're gonna send the roll around because there are people who came in a little bit late before it went around again, so if you've already signed it, sorry, we're gonna go by again. Thanks.
I think I'm going to go back real quick and use my highly productive Linux editor, VI. Does one laugh? And look at this again. So here's all my platform dependencies. I can actually target multiple frameworks in here. So I can say run on .NET 4.6 and .NET Core, and you should be able to handle that. But I can also, this is where I'm adding references. And if I want to do this from a command line perspective, I can do something like, make sure I spell it correctly. I expect this is something most of you are using, and I do want to specify a version. 901. So this is a version of the Newton Soft that is actually PCL'd and goes everywhere, including .NET Core. Do that to make sure my cache is up to date. Adds the extra package. Now I can actually use that. I'm not going to bore you with my typing. You've seen how bad I am at it already. But I have the JSON serializers now at my disposal. Okay, not a big deal. I think that's everything I wanted to show on the Linux box. We'll get back to the real world in a second. But let's go back into the beginning of my slide deck. We're almost back to the present. Time travel, isn't it great? All right. There's the demonstration. So, .NET on the server. And again, I expect you're going to see a deeper training on this later on in October, hopefully. But for me, I'm just going to introduce it. So, ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core, formerly known as ASP.NET 5. Both are still there, like I said. .NET 4.6 is there. It has everything under the sun. .NET Core, including ASP.NET Core, doesn't. It is refactored. It's not plug-and-play replacement. It's not like going from 4.0 to 4.6, where you just open the project and any upgrades are done for you. This is something where you have to do a little refactoring. There are a lot of things that are actually better about it. For example, the patterns or the architecture for MVC and Web API have been merged, so you don't have these two separate models. It's basically following the model that you've seen for Web API, which is the more modern view of the world. Inherit from a few different base classes, a few different namespaces, things like that. I'll give you some basic guidance for if you want to do a migration later on. But again, it's not an X copy from your .NET 4.6 MVC application to a ASP.NET Core MVC. But it is cross-platform. It's also highly performant. This was one of the big things about this. We wanted to make sure it was very lightweight, X copy deploy, cross-platform, performant, trying to make it amongst the best in the industry. And I say amongst the best, it is amongst the best right now. I believe the latest results I heard is from a benchmark perspective, ASP.NET Core 1.0 is approximately 23 times faster than ASP.NET 4.6. 23 times, it's not bad. And I think it's about as 10th as fast as we need to get to the fastest Java-based framework. And we have our sights set on it. So we're going to keep improving it, and you can expect that to get better and better. Just because you say, well, gee, Java's better, I should go with that. That's a Java framework. There are plenty that are slower than us, too. All right. So ASP.NET Core, MVC from the ground up, built-in dependency injection, Entity Framework, Entity Framework 6. It was, if you go back and do searches, you might find Entity Framework 7, which isn't what it is. It's been renamed Entity Framework Core. It is also refactored from the ground up. So it's the same concepts as Entity Framework. You'll have a lot of the same code that will just kind of work, and a lot of code that won't work. But this is meant to work on the smallest devices. You can run it on a mobile device, and you can back-end it with a SQLite type of scenario, or you can put it on a server and back-end it with a SQL Server or something else. Cross-platform and cross-database. So it's not, if you think about where Entity Framework started with the idea you'd do a model first from the database and bring things in and model them and all these other things, very much a different direction now. So, next demo. This time let's take a look at .NET Core. I'm going to bring up my Macintosh. Yes, this is a Macintosh. I have .NET installed on this as well. No surprise. Yeah. Get into my desktop. There's my temp folder. Now, I can do a .NET New again here, which gives you the basics, but there's also a very common open source scaffolding program named Yeoman. I assume a lot of you have seen that before. And I installed for Yeoman some ASP.NET scaffolding functions. So in this case, it's going to go out there and ask me what I want to create. Do I want to create a web app empty, a console app? I'm going to create a web app. This is going to look very familiar to you. Standard MVC starter app. And I'm actually going to have it turned on with authentication. So it's going to want to go out there to a database server and find the database. I don't have the database, so that won't work. But I can show you the code. And let's go with Bootstrap. And I'll be imaginative. We'll call it web application. All right, there's the scaffolding. You'll see it's running a lot of command line tools, native, Bower, to do package management on this side. And if I go look in there, there's the application we just created. Now, I installed on this box Visual Studio Code because as much as I like VI or gedit or some of those other ones, I wanted to show something that's a little nicer. You saw on the earlier slide, Visual Studio Code is one of the most contributed open source projects out there. This is Microsoft's developer editor program. It's a very powerful code editor. It's very lightweight and easy. It's not a full IDE, but some people would say it is. You have some people that are used to using the equivalent of Notepad. They'd say this is extremely full function. But it's not Visual Studio. It's a subset. So I can go in there and I can do basic editing. I can do basic debugging. I get basic IntelliSense. It's starting to sound like an IDE, isn't it? But there's my code, color coding, and this is what it just generated for me. And again, at a glance, you look at that and say, oh yeah, I write this code all the time. But you might look and say, yeah, but it is actually using some slightly different namespaces than I'm used to seeing and inheriting from different base classes that I want to. And if I actually look at this, I'll do this in Visual Studio later on because it'll be easier for me to show it. We'll show the same basic thing in Visual Studio. But there are some differences. There are some things in this packaging that are different. But I do have the project.json, as we were talking about earlier, with a few more dependencies than we saw in the Hello World version. And what I wanted to show you here is actually beyond there we go. Beyond just printing out hello. Let's restore the packages. Get my lock file. Apparently my package cache was not completely up to date. No, that wasn't too bad.
It just goes to show that Windows is faster than Mac.
There we go. I'm going to blame it on the fact that bits are running back to Denver and taking a lunch break on the way. No, it's on a Mac. What did I just say? Did I say .NET Run? It didn't work? Of course. What? Oh. Yeah. Yeah, you know, that explains a few things. There we go. Well, that's why I assume that Oh, actually, I already have the log file, so it already found it. So I didn't need to restore again. But it should be faster. Should be faster. Oh wait, we're in the middle of a demo, right? Things are never faster in a demo. But to avoid hurting myself more, I'm not going to hit Control-C. Come on. You wouldn't guess it, but this is actually a fairly fast MacBook. Come on. There we go. I think my network's a little bit saturated at the moment. No hands. There we go. And yes, I did hit enter. And if it keeps going this way, I'm going to say it's not worth the demo. What I did want to show you here is that what it's going to do is it's actually going to run effectively a console application. Gee, Dave, I thought you said this was going to be a web application. Well, yes, but it's actually effectively encapsulated in the console application. Self-hosting on, in this case, port 5000, that's the default, and it was based on what my project.json said. In Kestrel. Kestrel is the from the ground up web server that's made to self-host applications. So can I host this in IIS? Absolutely. But on the Macintosh, you don't have IIS. So I host it in Kestrel. In this case, it's running. If I bring up Safari, I'm sure that's everyone's favorite browser, right? Yeah. Are you using all my bandwidth, Eric? That actually looks good. Yeah, but you know, 4 bars LTE, you'd think it would be a little faster. You'd think.
Eric's eating up all the bandwidth.
Stop streaming stuff, man. There we go. I don't want weather. It's almost there. You can see it's trying. There we go. After all that. Hello world, except the ASP.NET version. And it's the same thing you're used to. You've seen very similar pages before. This is what the Yeoman scaffolding did. But again, I did this all on a Macintosh. Aside from the fact the bits took a long time to get back and forth, it worked kind of as you expect. Any surprise so far? Is this the stuff you guys already knew, or is this actually interesting? Am I going too slow? A little interesting? Okay. Okay. I think that's all I needed to show on the Macintosh. So the good news is everything else is going to be local. I won't have as good an excuse next time it gets slow. So there's Kestrel. And Kestrel works on Linux, works on Mac, works on Windows, and self-hosts. So now the tools. So you saw how elegant it was, how fast and easy it is to use VI on a Linux box, or your favorite console application. But if you're like me, I like Visual Studio. It's a very productive environment. So that, of course, has .NET Core capabilities built in, including ASP.NET Core MVC. It wraps the same command line. So this is actually a different approach. What Microsoft's done in the past is they baked it all into Visual Studio. And the idea you could actually access it outside of Visual Studio was kind of tough. Some of you have probably done, I can't even remember the command line now. The command line to launch Visual Studio to do a build, even though you don't really want Visual Studio, it's just that's the only way you get some kind of project to build, because it only existed in Visual Studio. It didn't exist as a separate command line. At this point forward, we're trying to move everything to command line first. Visual Studio just makes it easier. It does do all the package management. It does do a lot of other niceties in terms of like automatic deployment, packaging, send to Docker, all sorts of other wonderful stuff. Tools that in the Windows world we're not used to, Bower, Grunt, Gulp. I'm sure there is a grump out there somewhere. All that stuff's wrapped for you, so if you don't know what it is, don't worry about it. Now, I would frequently do Docker in this as well, People know what Docker is? Yeah. I'm not doing it right now because I'm going to have I've seen a heavy performance issue when I run Docker at the same time I'm trying to run Bash. So since I'm doing Bash second half, I've cut the Docker stuff. I'll show you where the tools fit in though. But otherwise, Visual Studio, Hello World. For those of you who have already tried .NET Core and downloaded the tools and played with them, this is probably exactly what you did. File, new project, which is fine. Create a new ASP.NET application, and I'll walk through a little of the structure of the application. So you'll see I have a template here for ASP.NET Core Web Application. Depending on what version of the tools you have going back, this has been called everything under the sun. I mean, you can find these project templates located almost anywhere. Doing a demo after an upgrade is like, I have no clue where to look for it. In this case, I selected already, but it's Visual C#, ASP.NET. Three project templates, Web API, Web Application, empty. We'll go with the default, with the ability to do things like change authentication, bind it to Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, host in the cloud, whatever. Same stuff you'd find in ASP.NET. Now, I say that, and I go back to what I said earlier. ASP.NET Core, Entity Framework Core, .NET Core are version 1.0s. They're refactored from the ground up. They're efficient. They're modular. They're lightweight, but they're not as feature rich. So there's going to be some favorite thing you have that doesn't exist here. Yet. Exactly. Thank you. I do want you to notice up here, restoring packages. The idea of add reference is different in .NET Core. In .NET, you'd right-click, add reference. You'd always go to a DLL. Doesn't mean you don't end up at a DLL, but this is all NuGet based. When you add a reference here, it's managing NuGet packages. That's really what you're doing. Okay, so now that the way project dependencies work is actually described in the NuGet package, which is a lot better than what we started with in .NET 1.0 16 years ago or 14 years ago. Looking at, and I don't know, can you guys read that okay? In the Solution Explorer? Good enough? I do want to walk through the structure that's different so you can actually see it, some things that are different. So the project.json is there, and as was noted earlier, it might evolve over time, exactly what the difference is the project.json and my project file is. I do want you to know I do have IntelliSense in here, so if I'm actually going there and adding a reference to something, I can actually get, IntelliSense going out there and sniffing the NuGet repositories to figure out what I could add. But that said, you can also right-click Add Reference or right-click Manage NuGet. So if you like doing things with the command line, you can do that. If you like doing it with the IDE, you can do that. I also have dependencies. This is kind of a new concept for us. That's not the same as references. Dependencies is talking about client-side dependencies. So if we think about jQuery, we have jQuery in a NuGet package, but NuGet is for server-side dependencies. So we're kind of force-fitting it to make that happen. In the client-side dependencies, I can see I've got Bootstrap, jQuery, et cetera. These are all meant to be client-side JavaScript managers. These are packages of the client side. So I've separated out what's a .NET package versus what's a JavaScript package. And it has the same type of thing, right-click, manage dependencies. The code, like I say, looks very much the same except for things like the namespaces and whatnot. You might not have everything there. The views are going to look very much the same. I do want to go through a few things that are different. If I look at the web.config, it might look a little bit smaller. Parts of these are handled in project.json. Parts of them are handled in the startup. But a lot of things like where am I going to handle my settings, my application settings that you always put in web config, my connection strings and things like that, the answer is probably in the app settings.json. And it doesn't have to be in app settings. It's going to be based on what you decide to put it in. So if I look at my startup, this is different than what I've seen before, but it allows me to register into the pipeline what I'm going to do. So for my configuration, I can look for configuration settings in app settings.json. I can also look at it in environment variables. And I could have other providers as well. And it will walk through the list until it finds that setting. So a common thing you find in the open source world is you might have a file or something in the development environment that you don't push to production, and it gets it from the environment variables on the production server instead. So that bizarre encrypted connection string, the developer never has access to it because it actually lives on the server that you're deploying to in an environment variable. So that's an option. It's up to you to determine how you want to do it, but it's obviously different than the classic web config we're used to. Right? There are other things configured in here as well. My dependency injection. various other services. I don't think this actually works this way anymore. And I mentioned MVC and Web API are using the same routing mechanisms now, which is nice. Last time I checked, this didn't really matter. I don't know. But when I did this in the early demos, you'd actually take out the useStatic files, which is effectively the ability to put the package in that says, I know how to manage HTML files, static content, and you pull that out and it couldn't serve HTML files, static content. Reduce the footprint, very less hackable. But again, my point is very modular. If you don't tell it how to handle it, it won't handle it. So hopefully that's useful. Project.json's the same. Let's see, anything else that's I really need to show out here? I'll go ahead and I'll run it. I'm actually going to do, I can run it under IIS Express. I can also do Web Application 4, which is the name of the project. Now, I'm going to do that just because this is not what you'd be used to, but it's what you saw on the Macintosh. This is going to use the Kestrel server. It's going to compile down to command line. It's going to bring up command line console. It's going to time out on my browser because I always have a race condition here where it brings up the browser before it actually brings up the command line. The server's not running yet. That's okay. You hit the refresh button and it works. So there's our compile. There's our server. Running on port 5000, just like you saw before, because that's my default in the project settings. As I said, it didn't work, but okay, like I said, I can't use an excuse this time. There we go. So it's running on port 5000, and we get the exact same application. This time it was, to me, a little easier because I just said file new. All right, you can see the background is actually tracing everything. I'm in developer mode. But the templates aren't identical between the Yeoman templates and the Visual Studio templates, but they're pretty close. All right, pretty easy. I am going to show you in the background. I'm going to try to show you in the background. I do have things like the diagnostic tools. I can do single-step debug, all the stuff you would expect to be able to do in Visual Studio. For the most part, I can do. Can't do everything, but for the most part, it looks just like you're used to seeing in Visual Studio. So we'll close out of this and let it close my application, and I'm back to where I started. I'm going to show here, from a Docker perspective, I have the Docker tools installed, but I'm not actually going to go so far as to push it because if I try, it will break it for me because I don't have Docker running. I can go in here and add Docker support, and this will add a bunch of PowerShell scripts and some other things that allow me to actually automatically deploy this to a Docker container. So within a few clicks, if I have Docker running in my local box, which is a possibility these days, which basically has a virtual machine, a Linux virtual machine running, a very lightweight one with Docker running on it, I can deploy ASP.NET from my Visual Studio instance into a Docker container running on a VM on my box with a few clicks. Kind of neat. What I'm going to do instead, though, is I'm going to package this, publish it to the file system. From a timing perspective, okay. Publish it to, let's put it on my desktop. No, I already have a temp folder. We'll use temp. Good. And it will take a few seconds to build everything. As part of the publish activity, it's going to bring down all the packages and all the DLLs that it needs to from a dependency perspective and put in the same folder. Assuming my targets are set to be cross-platform .NET Core, I'll get all the assemblies that are cross-platform. For the record, when you actually deploy this to a box that's running on Linux or whatever else, the packages that will come down will include a very few set of shims that are actually very platform specific. But 90+%, 98%, 95%, really depends on what you're doing, is the exact same code in all boxes. And it's the framework code that carries across if you're using a specific function that only works a certain way in Linux or Mac or Windows. So let's see, am I done building? I think I'm done building, let's see. Temp. No, I'm not done building. Did it exit? Syntax error. My whole point on this was to show you the size of the executable after it's done publishing. I'm not going to fight it for too long. In this case, this application comes out to, I think, 10 meg with all the dependencies. So again, in terms of X-copying my framework with my code, That's not very big. A lot of us have images that are larger than that. Bundled. That's taking longer. That's a good sign. Yeah, there we go. Not quite done. There we go. Publish succeeded. Properties, 9 meg. And if I were to actually go in here, desktop, temp, .NET. In this case, I'm not going to do a run because there's no project.json file. Instead, I'm going to go right to the DLL that actually runs this. Web application 4.dll with its entry point. And there we go, port 5000 again. I could go hit that. I could X-copy it to another system that has this capability and do the same thing, even a non-Windows system. So I think it's cool. All right, so enough of that. I think that's all I wanted to show in this part of the demo. We have a few more slides, but not very few. I'm actually going to go into a bonus content section after, I guess, showing you this. From a porting perspective, like I say, and I have a bunch of hidden slides in here. I'll make the deck available. You can migrate whenever you're ready. .NET 4.6, the full framework, whatever's coming next, and they do have vNext listed in roadmaps. It's not going away. Enterprises have lots of very important applications. The world has very important applications written in the core framework, the full framework, not core. It's not going away. But the future of our investment is obviously going to be in the .NET Core side. So as we see .NET Core 1.1, 1.2, 2.0, whatever else, we see lots of innovation there. From what I've seen talking to the product group, we have the ability to move the code back and forth. There's a lot of shared code there. We've seen there was a bug fixed in .NET Core identified by somebody in the community that was a very hard to find thing in threading that we didn't even know was an issue. Somebody in the community found the fix, submitted it, we verified it, and we moved that fix back into 4.6.x. Interesting. So good, but it's not feature rich. So new things you want to do, you should definitely consider moving in this direction. If you say, well, I just want to move for the sake of moving, maybe not yet. Talking to a few people beforehand, it still feels a little version 1. But it's a very solid platform, very solid foundation for going forward. If you do want to do it, here's some basic guidance in terms of how to do it. You do have things from a dependency perspective, third party. You're going to have to look at what targets this so that the .NET Core can support it. So if you're bringing in third parties, it might not work for you. Sometime in the future, though, you might find things that are supported in .NET Core that are in the full framework. So there is an analyzer tool. You can see here the heat map from an Excel spreadsheet that actually shows the results of that in terms of where your code will work and won't work, or how much it's going to work. On the client side, no demos here. Xamarin is still using Mono, which is not the end of the world. But Universal Windows Apps uses .NET Core, but uses .NET Core compiled down to native code. So on your ARM devices and whatnot, when you get out the other side, you have very efficient, very battery efficient, low memory footprint, good code. But it starts with the .NET Core to get to that point. It effectively runs it through the C# or the C++ linker to get to that point. Faster, leaner, et cetera, et cetera. All right. But you look at that. We saw this package when we were looking at the in the NuGet feeds earlier. That was all. I usually show a demo there. I'm not going to show one. All right. Going forward, I'm going to introduce the concept of .NET Standard Library and the unification of .NET. We have a lot of things that you can write C# in. ASP.NET Core, .NET Core, Xamarin, Universal Windows Platform, Classic, .NET 4.6. All look a lot the same, but are all in a lot of ways very different. Some things are always going to be different, but some things shouldn't be. So if we look at today, base libraries specifically, so I have the app model. WPF running on Windows is always going to be WPF running on Windows. It's not like it's going to magically appear on an iPhone. It just doesn't make sense. It's not the right type of framework for it. But the base class libraries, I have a lot of common things, and those common things are effectively replicated for .NET Framework, for .NET Core, and Mono. So I have different versions of the .NET base class libraries today. But what we're in the process of doing is merging them all into the .NET Standard library. .NET Standard library is effectively, from a concept perspective, the next generation of PCL, portable class libraries. Portable class libraries would always go and say, this is what I support. I support this framework and that framework, whatever else it happens to be. This doesn't say that. This says, I am .NET Standard 1.x. And based on that, anybody who can consume that can work with me. And therefore, I don't care if you're running on an iPhone or on a Windows server or on a Linux box. .NET Standard becomes a common platform for us to work through and allows us to work on one set of code and not 3 sets of code. So that makes us more efficient as well. Just a look at where .NET Standard falls in when it comes in. So, .NET Standard version 1.6 is when .NET Core 1.0 added support. And you can look to the left in terms of what you support. So .NET Core can support any of these libraries. If you had a library that was written in .NET Standard 1.0, we can support it in .NET Core. If you have a library that was written in 1.1 .NET Standard, it will not work on a Windows Phone Silverlight. Surprise, surprise. Lots of things are changing. .NET Standard is the next iteration of the base class libraries, and it will be standard across all these platforms, but it's still incomplete. Here's some of the stuff that's coming into it. This is all public information. You can actually go into GitHub and see the roadmap as published, but they do have time frames in terms of when different things are supposed to happen. Fall is what's published, is going to be .NET Core 1.1. We're continuing to iterate on NuGet packages, on framework packages, on compiler changes, on language changes, on tool changes. It becomes more of a continuous flow. Although we'll have big events and big version release type stuff where things come out all at the same time, it's not going to be that way where we have a 2-year cycle before you see anything. It's very much a continuous flow. References page, come back to it. Bonus section, Linux on Windows. This is kind of interesting. It's going the other direction. Instead of saying, how can I take .NET and run it on Linux, how can I run Linux on Windows? You guys may or may not be as familiar with this. How many of you have heard of the Bash on Ubuntu on Windows? You guys are pretty good. So standard, any computer system, Windows, non-Windows, user mode, kernel mode. We have actually implemented a Windows subsystem on the latest releases, preview releases of Windows. It allows you to actually provide the hook so that you can actually run Linux binaries on Windows. We've mapped at the lower levels at the syscalls to provide that. Ubuntu is a shell that sits on top of it. And so the Ubuntu Linux we think about is the Linux kernel plus Ubuntu. Now we're taking the Windows kernel, emulating Linux, and we're throwing Ubuntu, actual Ubuntu on top of it. It actually downloads the Ubuntu on top, from Canonical. You have to agree to their terms and conditions and runs it on top of Windows. In general, performance-wise and stuff, it looks very similar. I/O is, I think, the biggest bottleneck we have right now. It's not as fast, but we even find some things where Ubuntu on Windows runs faster than Ubuntu on Linux. How's that for interesting? But as a developer, this is a great developer story, and that's what it's really intended to be. As a developer, if you need to get access to these things, but you don't want to have to go boot up a Linux VM, you can do this. So, real quick demo. I know some of you are probably anxious to get out of here. I don't blame you. So, there's why I was running earlier. I'm just going to say bash. I've already installed it. I've done the Windows, and now I have a $sign prompt. I'm actually running under different windows, running in Linux on Windows. Very fast. I actually have .NET in here. If I wanted to, I could actually do the exact same .NET new demo I did earlier. I'm not going to torment you on that. It'd run faster, though. But I can, ipt just get, and it's not going to work because I need to sudo install CMatrix. I don't think I have this one on here yet. Since I'm installing something, I need to do that. Those are Linux binaries pulled down from the web, connecting and downloading extremely slowly over my Verizon network connection. Maybe I shouldn't do this.
0%.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to torment you with that. We'll see if the Control C key works. LS, which doesn't mean much, right? VI. Does it do which? I've used the browser. Oh, yeah, soft links, yeah. There's actually a local file system in here that it actually is running under here. So right here you see I'm on effectively a Linux file system. And so yes, I have soft links, hard links, absolutely, no problem. It's as far as it knows, it's Linux. It's not, but it's a good emulation at this point. There are definitely some things that don't work. I'll go into a couple of them in just a second. But it's a great starting point. I know what I was going to do. You do have the ability to, that's my hard drive. That's my Windows partition now. So I mounted it, C/MNT/C in this case. It automatically did that for me. Otherwise, I was on the, kind of backwards, I was on a partition on the Windows hard drive that thought it, a file that thought it was a Linux partition, and now I'm on the mounted C partition that actually owns that partition, that container. I have a recursive issue. Not going to spend any more time there. You guys get the gist of it. It works pretty well. If you have specific workloads, you like doing Node or something like that in the Linux environment, fantastic. In fact, you can even get, and I have it running on here, I'm not going to demo it, you can even use an X server on Windows and run it from Bash on Windows. So you good old XIs and the X logo and whatever else you want. If you have your favorite game that runs on X Windows, you can actually run it on your Windows desktop running on Bash on Windows. But you have options. Again, Microsoft's not a closed ecosystem. We recognize there are lots of different ways to achieve your goals. We're trying to give you the options. This came by way of the Windows team. You do need insider preview after Windows 10 anniversary update to get it. To me, it seems to work very well. There are some things that don't work well. Top, MySQL, not quite there yet. Docker and containers is, a lot of people say, oh, I want to do that. That's one that does not work. And although it may work eventually, that's not a target for us because there's already native ways to run Docker on Windows without having to go this route. Question?
It's in the anniversary update, so you don't need to be in the preview track in order to run it now, but there is newer versions of preview track.
Yes. Yeah, so you need to be on build 14.3.16 or later, 64-bit only. I skipped over this slide. But you do have to be in developer mode still, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's all documented. If you guys are playing around with the anniversary build, absolutely. That was everything I had. You guys sat pretty well. I assume the food settled well. You guys are in nice afternoon nap time. Are there any other questions before we shut down the video? Jim, any announcements? No? All right. Well, thank you.